It was a cold, rainy afternoon when people started arriving for the funeral. Family, friends, acquaintances, all gathered to pay their respects to a man who, by all appearances, had touched many lives. The room was filled with the low hum of murmured conversations, shared memories, and polite condolences. As guests entered, they barely glanced at the small, frail woman sitting quietly in the back corner. Dressed in a simple black dress, with tired eyes and worn hands folded in her lap, she seemed almost invisible. No one approached her, no one asked who she was, and no one offered her any kind words. She was just there. The service began, and as the preacher spoke of the deceased's many accomplishments, highlighting his generosity, success, and the love he had supposedly shown to all, the elderly woman remained silent, her eyes fixed on the casket. She listened without reaction as people took turns delivering eulogies, praising the man as a pillar of the community. But there was something unsettling in her stillness, a quiet intensity that grew more noticeable as the service went on. Some of the guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, sneaking curious glances in her direction. Who was she? Why was she here? And why hadn't anyone spoken to her? As the service drew to a close, people started preparing to leave, gathering their coats and exchanging final condolences. But before anyone could walk out, the elderly woman stood up. Slowly, she made her way to the front of the room, her steps slow but deliberate. The air seemed to thicken with tension as she approached the podium, and an eerie silence fell over the room. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the crowd. People whispered amongst themselves, unsure of what to expect. And then she spoke. "I'm not here to mourn the man in that casket," she said, her voice strong despite her frail appearance. The guests were stunned into silence. "You've all spoken of his kindness, his generosity, and the love he supposedly gave. But none of you really knew him. Not like I did." Her words cut through the air like a knife, leaving the audience frozen in place. No one had expected this. The image of the deceased had been one of a beloved community leader, a man who had left behind nothing but goodwill. But the woman's tone suggested something much darker. "What you've heard today," she continued, "is a lie. I knew the truth about him. The real truth." The tension in the room was unbearable. Eyes darted between the woman and the casket, as if waiting for some sort of explanation or sign. But none came. Instead, the woman let her words hang in the air, her silence more powerful than anything she could have said. "I could tell you things," she said quietly, her voice shaking ever so slightly. "Things that would change everything you thought you knew about him." And with that, she turned and walked back to her seat, leaving the entire room in stunned disbelief. Whispers erupted, but no one dared approach her, too afraid of what else she might reveal. As the guests exchanged bewildered looks, it was clear that the funeral had taken a sharp turn, and nothing would be the same. What was this truth the woman claimed to know? What could she have possibly meant? The questions hung heavy in the air, leaving everyone in the room desperate for answers. But for now, all they could do was wonder, as the elderly woman sat back down in silence, keeping her secrets to herself for the time being. The truth would come out eventually, but not before it changed everything. As the crowd sat in uneasy silence, still processing the elderly woman's shocking words, a few brave souls began whispering to each other. Who was she? How did she know the deceased? Some guests even wondered if she had mistaken this funeral for someone else's. But no one could deny the certainty in her voice or the weight of her presence. A younger woman, seated near the back, couldn't stop staring at the elderly woman. Her name was Lisa, a distant niece of the deceased, and though she had only met him a handful of times at family gatherings, the man's image had always been one of respectability. Now she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. Lisa leaned over to her brother, who was equally baffled. "I don't know," her brother replied, glancing nervously at the woman. "But if she is, there's a whole lot we don't know about him." As the guests started to leave the room, most of them tried to pretend nothing had happened, brushing off the elderly woman's remarks as the ramblings of someone overcome with grief. But a few couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Among them was Sarah, the deceased's daughter. She had always been proud of her father, viewing him as a man who had provided for his family, supported his community, and lived a life of integrity. But something about the way the woman had spoken. Sarah approached the woman after most of the guests had left. "Excuse me," she said, her voice hesitant but firm. "I'm Sarah, his daughter. I don't mean to intrude, but you said you knew my father. Could you tell me how?" The elderly woman looked up at her, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and something else, perhaps regret or maybe anger. "Yes, I knew him," she said, her voice quieter now. "I knew him better than you ever did." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The woman sighed, glancing around as if deciding whether or not to share the truth she had hinted at earlier. "Your father, he wasn't the man you all thought he was. He had a past, a dark one he kept hidden from everyone, even his own family." Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. "A dark past? What are you talking about?" The woman shook her head. "I can't explain it all here. But know this, your father was responsible for things he never told you. Things that caused a lot of pain to a lot of people, including me." Sarah was taken aback. Her father had never spoken of any such things. He was always the dependable, loving parent. But the way this woman spoke, with such conviction, left her rattled. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "Why didn't you come forward before?" "Because it wasn't my place," the woman replied. "I thought I could live with the secrets, but seeing everyone praise him today, I couldn't stay silent any longer." Sarah felt her world tilting. Everything she thought she knew about her father was being questioned by this stranger, but she needed more answers. "Tell me," she pressed. "What did he do?" The woman hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking. "Your father, he wasn't always a good man. He was involved in things you couldn't even imagine. Back in the day, he hurt people like me, and he never paid for what he did." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to dismiss this woman's claims, but something in the pit of her stomach told her there was truth behind her words. "Hurt you?" Sarah asked. "How?" The woman looked down at her hands, which trembled slightly. "It's a long story, one that doesn't have a happy ending. He made choices that destroyed lives. And while he moved on, built a new life, we were left behind to pick up the pieces." Sarah felt the weight of the woman's words sink in. She needed to know more. But before she could ask anything else, the woman stood up slowly, leaning on her cane. "I said enough for now. If you really want to know the truth, you'll have to be ready for it. It's not something you can unhear." Sarah stood there, stunned, as the woman began to walk away. She didn't know what to do, her mind racing with questions. Could this woman really be telling the truth? Could her father have been someone entirely different from the man she had known and loved? As the elderly woman reached the door, she paused, turning back to Sarah. "I'll be in touch," she said quietly, "when you're ready to hear it all." And with that, she left, leaving Sarah standing alone in the empty funeral parlor, the weight of her father's possible secrets pressing down on her like a lead blanket. Back at home that night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the woman's words in her head, wondering what her father had been hiding all these years. As she sifted through old memories, little things began to surface, small moments, fleeting comments, things she had brushed off as insignificant at the time. Could they have been signs? The tension built inside her, and she realized that the only way to move forward was to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. But what if the truth shattered everything she had believed about her father? And so Sarah made a decision. She would meet with the elderly woman again. She had to know, no matter the cost. But what she would discover would not only change her view of her father, but unravel secrets that stretched far beyond her family, secrets that others were willing to go to great lengths to keep buried. The suspense was only beginning, and Sarah had no idea how deep the rabbit hole would go in the days that followed. Sarah found herself unable to focus on anything other than her father's hidden past. Every photo, every memory of him seemed tainted now, as if shadows had been cast over the man she once thought she knew so well. She couldn't stop thinking about the elderly woman's cryptic words, and the more she dwelled on it, the more desperate she became for answers. Finally, Sarah decided to meet with the woman. She reached out and set up a time to visit her at her small apartment. As she knocked on the door, her heart pounded in her chest, anxiety swirling through her. She didn't know what she would hear, but she knew she had to face whatever truth awaited her. The woman invited her inside, offering Sarah a seat in a dimly lit living room. It was humble, filled with worn furniture and faded photographs. The woman sat across from her, her eyes filled with a heavy sadness. "I didn't mean to hurt you the other day," the woman began softly. "But I couldn't let your father's story go untold. Not after everything that happened." Sarah leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know. What did my father do?" The woman took a deep breath, and for a moment, it seemed like she wasn't sure where to start. Then slowly, she began to unravel the past. She told Sarah about a time when her father had been a different man, years before Sarah was even born. He had been involved in a group that preyed on vulnerable people, manipulating them for financial gain, leaving them destitute and broken. The elderly woman herself had been one of his victims. "He didn't just ruin lives," the woman said, her voice trembling. "He destroyed families. He took everything from us, and then he disappeared, moving on as if none of it had ever happened." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She couldn't reconcile the man the woman was describing with the father she had known. But why? Sarah asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Why did he do it?" "I don't know," the woman replied quietly. "Greed. Power. I can't say for certain, but he wasn't the man you thought he was. He built a new life for himself, but he left a trail of pain behind him." The revelation hit Sarah like a tidal wave. Her father, the man who had raised her, who had seemed so kind and loving, had a past full of cruelty and deception. She wanted to deny it, to cling to the image of him she had always known, but deep down she couldn't. There was too much conviction in the woman's words, too much pain in her eyes. "I'm sorry," the woman said gently. "I know this is hard to hear, but you deserved to know the truth." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she struggled to process everything. "I don't know what to do with this," she admitted. "How can I move forward, knowing what he did?" The woman reached out and took Sarah's hand in her own. "You're not responsible for his actions," she said, "but you have the power to decide how to live your life. You can choose to be better than he was, to make amends in ways he never did." Sarah wiped her eyes, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She felt a strange mixture of grief, anger, and relief. Grief for the man she had lost, anger for the deception, and relief that she now understood the full picture. Over the next few days, Sarah began to find peace in the idea that, while her father had made grave mistakes, she could choose a different path. She reached out to the families he had harmed, offering her support and apologies on behalf of her father. Some were receptive, while others were too hurt to listen. But Sarah knew it was the right thing to do. In the end, Sarah realized that the truth, no matter how painful, was something she needed to confront. Her father's legacy was not as perfect as she had believed, but she also understood that people were complicated, capable of both good and evil. His past would always be a part of her story, but it didn't have to define her future. As she walked through her father's empty house one last time, Sarah paused by the fireplace, looking at the framed photograph of him smiling warmly. She had loved him, and in some ways, she always would. But now she saw him for who he truly was, flawed, human, capable of mistakes, as well as kindness. With a deep breath, Sarah left the house and stepped into the sunlight, ready to build a life on her own terms, free from the shadows of her father's past. The truth had set her free, and now she could begin to heal. The story that had begun with a shocking revelation at a funeral had come full circle. The truth about the deceased had been exposed, but in the end, it was Sarah's journey of discovery, forgiveness, and strength that brought closure to the tale. And in that, she found a new beginning.